For this comparative study, my area of film focus is queer theory, and my topic is how is queerness represented in the selected films depending on cultural context. The two films being analyzed are Hellraiser, directed by Clive Barker in 1987 in Britain, and Thelma, directed by Joachim Trier in 2017 in Norway. Queer theory first emerged in the early 1990s, and it concerned itself with the deconstruction of identity as normalized by society. Thus, queer theory aims at disrupting and politicizing all presumed relations between and among sex, gender, bodies, sexuality, and desire. Furthermore, an object of queer theory is to read the queer subtext of canonical works, from films of the early 20th century to modern films, which involves going against traditional critical practices to reveal the regular structures that define and qualify heterosexuality and cisgender as normal. Both the films, Hellraiser and Thelma, have different cultural contexts that connect to the queer community. Since Hellraiser was made in 1987, it was released during the AIDS epidemic in the UK, which affected gay and bisexual men most strongly. Because of the group's association with the deceased, a public hatred was directed against them. In contrast, Thelma was made in 2017 in Norway, which is, in general, a queer-friendly country, scoring 78% on the Rainbow Europe Country Ranking in 2017, which takes into account the country's LGBTQ equality laws and policies. However, national surveys have shown a correlation between negative beliefs regarding LGBTQ rights and people with stronger religious backgrounds, conveying still rooted notions of heteronormativity that cause internal conflicts in the queer individuals who come from religious communities. It is worth exploring these films through the lens of queer theory because there is the opportunity to study how cinematic depictions of queerness can change between two different time periods, 1987 and 2017, in two different countries, Britain and Norway. To that end, Hellraiser and Thelma represent queerness using the motif of queer monstrosity and montage in order to form parallels between the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and the struggles queer religious Norwegians face in coming out. Film theorist Robin Wood wrote an essay titled Return of the Repressed in 1978, which argues that monsters in film embody anti-normative ideals because normality is threatened by the monster. Wood states that normality is generally presented as the heterosexual monogamous couple, the family, and the social institutions that support and defend them. Although the main focus of the essay is on the horror genre, Wood's observations on monsters and normality are also applicable to any other genre films with monsters in them. And why does it have to be a monster? Wood wrote two conditions that must be met for a film to express the collective nightmare of a society. One, what is repressed is considered so terrible that it must be expressed as monstrous, and two, that the repressed is powerful enough to constitute a threat towards normality. Thus, homosexuality must be portrayed as monstrous because it meets both conditions, as it threatens the heteronormative fabric of society. Furthermore, the formula normality is threatened by the monster is made up of three components: normality, which is defined as conformity to the dominant social norms, the monster, and the relationship between normality and the monster. When this formula is applied to depict queerness using monstrosity as subtext, it forms the motif of queer monstrosity. Applying the formula to the films Hellraiser and Thelma, normality is heterosexuality, and the monsters are the Cenobites in Hellraiser. Indeed, to the heterosexual family at the core of the film, the Cenobites are demons that threaten their normative perceptions of sexual pleasure. Then, Thelma herself is the monster in Thelma, because her supernatural powers are an uncontrollable force with the capacity for destruction. This also fits into one of the five recurrent motifs of monstrosity as identified by Wood, the terrible child. For the formula's third component, the relationship between normality and the monster, it is presented in each film through their cultural context. Hellraiser was made during the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, and because gay men were the most affected group of people, a public hate grew against homosexuality. Instead of gay sex being seen as a risk for infection, it became a sign of infection. In fact, in a poll conducted by the News of the World, which was a popular Sunday newspaper in the UK, 51% voted in favor of the recriminalization of homosexuality. Consequently, because the queer community was feared and reviled by the heteronormative public, so too are the Cenobites feared and reviled by the heterosexual family at the center of the film. For Thelma's cultural context, in Norway, queer religious individuals can experience repression spurred by the strict religious ideals from their communities that do not tolerate homosexuality. The director, Joachim Trier, was motivated to include this religious background in the film because he wanted to cast a light on the way that religion can be used as a suppressive mechanism, in this case, in the way that religion can suppress queerness. In the context of Norway, a few years before the release of the film, there were some queer Christian individuals who committed suicide because of the shame they felt from their identities, and it is this internal conflict that is presented in the film. So, in Thelma, the protagonist, who is also the monster, is conflicted because of her psychic powers, activated by her burgeoning queer sexuality, and her family's strict Christian values, causing a continuous state of conflict between the normality Thelma longs to be a part of and the monstrous side of her character, which is her queer identity. Thus, in Hellraiser, homosexuality is seen as monstrous by society due to the AIDS epidemic, while in Thelma it is viewed as monstrous by the self, caused by the prejudiced Christian ideals enforced by the family. This difference is subsequently depicted in the way normality and the monster are separated in Hellraiser, but are one in Thelma, existing in the same individual. In this way, both films use the motif of queer monstrosity to depict queerness. In both films, a montage is used to convey themes present throughout the entirety of the films. In Hellraiser, the montage contrasts Julia reminiscing about a sexual encounter to Larry cutting his hand open on a loose nail, thus uniting two elements, pain and pleasure, a key theme of the film. In Thelma, the montage occurs when Thelma is invited to a ballet by her crush, Anya. When Anya starts to make advances towards her, the montage unites the shots of the passion of the dancers, which evokes her aroused sexuality, of Thelma trying to stop her impending seizure, and the danger of the swaying ceiling fixture. The last two are caused by Thelma's psychic powers, which are activated whenever she thinks about, or is close to, Anya. However, because she tries to repress her sexuality, her powers manifest dangerously, as seizures and other dangerous situations, like the ceiling fixture that is about to fall. Consequently, the film joins both pain and pleasure. The result of both films using Soviet montage theory to join images that underline the connection between pain and pleasure is that sex is characterized as a self-destructive force, which applies the ideals of the queer antisocial theory. The theory was primarily posited by film theorist Leo Bersani in his 1987 essay Is Wrecked in a Grave, which discusses the fundamental understandings of the theory. In essence, the queer antisocial theory defines sex as a self-shattering force because it undoes the self. Following this idea, the object in sexuality is irrelevant, and sex functions as a means of self-debasement where the self is discarded. Thus, instead of sex enforcing bonds between partners, it is anti-communal and anti-loving. In Hellraiser, sex is celebrated precisely because of its ability to shatter the self, with the Cenobites using extreme pain and pleasure to push people beyond their limits. As Bersani wrote in this essay, the opposition between pleasure and pain becomes relevant, and the sexual emerges as the juiceons have exploded limits. As the ecstatic suffering towards the human organism, it momentarily plunges when it is pressed beyond a certain threshold of endurance. Sexuality, at least in the mode in which it is constituted, may be a tautology for masochism. When examining the context of the AIDS epidemic, the ideals of the queer antisocial theory are made more powerful. Because the queer community, primarily gay men, were the individuals most affected by AIDS, sex became intrinsically tied to both pain and pleasure. But if the rectum is the grave, then sex should be celebrated all the more for the pleasures it brings. Thus, gay sex should be celebrated for its self-destruction, for positing the phallic male as an infinitely loved object of sacrifice, instead of being reviled by the heterosexual public. Consequently, the destructive power of sex is revered in Hellraiser, embodied by the Cenobites and their infinite pleasures. In contrast, Thelma presents the self-destruction of sex as a force to be feared. In the montage, self-destruction is shown through Thelma's seizures in the ceiling fixture, which threaten to destroy her precisely because they are caused by her sexual repression. In Norway, queer individuals who come from religious backgrounds can experience internalized homophobia due to their ingrained conservative ideals. Trier, the director, was inspired to add these elements of self-destruction stemming from self-repression. When in researching for the film, a doctor told him that many of the patients that were experiencing psychogenic seizures, which are seizures caused by psychological factors and are not neurological in origin, were lesbians who were suppressing their identities because of their religious backgrounds. Consequently, in the film, sex is self-destructive because in order for Thelma to embrace her sexuality, she has to confront her conservative Christian upbringing and break down the harmful beliefs regarding homosexuality that she has been taught her entire life, much like the queer religious Norwegians that the doctor was referring to. Therefore, it is an entire deconstruction of the self. In short, Hellraiser and Thelma use montages to link pain and pleasure, connecting to the queer antisocial theory and its ideals of sex as self-shattering. However, in Hellraiser, due to the pain caused by the AIDS epidemic towards the queer community, sex is celebrated, while in Thelma, because of the self-repression of Norwegians caused by religious backgrounds, sex is feared. In conclusion, queerness is presented in Hellraiser and Thelma through the motif of queer monstrosity and montage. Applying this motif, Hellraiser portrays the monstrous views regarding homosexuality that existed in Britain due to the AIDS epidemic, while Thelma portrays the way that queer individuals can view themselves as monstrous because of their harmful religious ideals. Meanwhile, through montages that link both pain and pleasure to present sex as a self-shattering force, Hellraiser functions as a celebration of sex, evoking the pain and sacrifice of the queer community during the AIDS epidemic. In contrast, Thelma portrays sex as a force to be feared, this fear enforced by the intolerant religious backgrounds of queer Norwegian individuals. In this way, both films represent queerness through diverse approaches and meanings that tie into each one's cultural context.